Hey there, family. This is Uncle Navi back with The Ship Who Sang, reading Chapter 2, The Ship Who Mourned. So, hope everybody's in their pajamas. Yes, I am in my pajamas. Okay, so. With eyes that did not register what they saw, Helva watched stolidly as the Regulus base personnel broke ranks at the conclusion of Jennan's funeral. Never again, she vowed, would she be known as the Ship Who Sang. That part of her had died with Jenna. From somewhere very far away from her emotional centers, she impassively watched the little figures separate, pair off, walking rapidly to continue interrupted tasks or moving slowly back to the barracks. Some, passing, looked up, but she did not interpret their glances. She had nowhere to move to, and no desire to move anywhere away from the graveside of her dead partner. It cannot end like this, she thought, anguish overpowering the stupor in her heart. It cannot be like this. But what do I go on to now? X-Ray Hotel 834. Theoda of Medea requests permission to enter, said a voice at the base of the lift. Permission granted, Helva said automatically. So absorbed in her grief was Helva that by the time the lift had deposited the slender female figure at the lock, Helva had forgotten that she had permitted entry. The woman advanced towards the central shaft behind which Helva was embedded in her shell. In her hand she held out a command reel. Well, insert it, snapped Helva when the woman made no other move. Where? I'm not regular service. The tape explains the mission, but in the northwest quadrant of the central panel you will observe a blue slot. Insert the tape with the wind tab in position nearest the red center knob of the panel. Press the blue button marked Relay, and if you are unaware of the text and are cleared for it, press the second yellow button marked Audio. Please be seated. Dispassionately, and with no more than a fleeting awareness that she ought to have put Theoda at her ease, or made some attempt at graciousness, Helva watched the woman fumble before she was able to insert the tape. Theoda sank uncertainly into the pilot's chair as the tape began. X-Ray Hotel 834, you will proceed in the company of physiotherapist Theoda of Medea to the NDE system Lyrae 2 Anagon 4 and present all aid possible in rehabilitation program of Van Gogh space plague survivors. All haste, all haste, all haste. Helva slammed the stop signal on the tape and called central control. Does physiotherapist Theoda constitute my replacement? No, X-Ray Hotel 834. Theoda is not in service. Your replacement is delayed in transit. Proceed in all haste. Repeat, all haste to Anagoni. Request permission for immediate lift. Established routine procedures took Helva through takeoff before she consciously realized what she was doing. Leaving Regulus was the last thing she wanted to do, but she had her order tape, and she had heard the imperative all haste repeated. All areas clear for lifting. Proceed. An X-Ray Hotel 834? Yes? Good luck. Acknowledged, said Helva, ignoring the softened, unofficial farewell. To Theoda, she explained briefly how to strap herself into the pilot chair, following the woman's nervous fingers as they stumbled over the fastenings. Finally, assured Theoda would be secure during acceleration, Helva lifted, her rear screen picking up the base cemetery as long as vision permitted. It no longer made any difference to Helva what speed she attained, but when she found herself increasing acceleration in an unconscious desire to finish her mission quickly and return to Regulus base, and to Jenin, she sternly measured her rate against Theoda's tolerance. Journey speed achieved, she told Theoda that she could leave the chair. Theoda unsnapped the harness and stood uncertainly. I was sent here so quickly I've traveled 24 hours already, she said, looking down at her rumpled, dirty uniform. Quarters are aft of the central column, and Helva gasped inwardly as she realized Theoda would inhabit the place so recently vacated by Jenin. Instinctively, she glanced in the cabin. Someone had already removed Jenin's personal effects. Not one memento remained of his tenancy, no souvenir of their brief happiness. Her feeling of desolation deepened. How could they? When had they? It was unfair. And now she must endure this fumbling female. Females. Theoda had already entered the cabin, throwing her kit bag on the bunk and entering the head. Helva politely withdrew her vision. She tried to make believe the homey noises of showering were Jennings, but her new passenger's ways were completely different. The difference, oh, the difference to me, cried Helva, mourning. Lost in elegy, she became only gradually aware of the quiet ship and, scanning discreetly, saw Theoda stretched out on her back in the limp, deep slumber of the exhausted. In repose, the woman was older than Helva had initially assumed. Now, too, Helva justly attributed the ineptitude and fumbling to the true cause, exhaustion. The face was deeply lined with sorrow as well as fatigue. There were dark smudges under the closed eyes. The mouth was dragged down at the corners from familiarity with pain. The long, blunt-ended fingers twitched slightly in reflex to a disturbing dream, and Helva could see the inherent strength and sensitivity, the marks of use and odd scars on palm and fingers, unusual in an age where manual work was mainly confined to punching buttons.
Hello, sweetheart. The opal has entered the... Oh, the opal has exited the chat. Oh, she wants the rice.
You do not get my dinner, best beloved. You get your own, and you already had it.
Yes, I know, but I love you.
All right.
Stop interrupting. Over here.
Jenin had used his hands too, came the unbidden comparison. Morning reclaimed Helva. How long did I sleep? Theoda's voice broke into Helva's reminiscences as the woman wove sleepily into the forward cabin. How much longer is the trip?
I'm not getting you more dinner.
You slept 18 hours. The tape estimates an elapse of 49 hours galactic to Anagoni orbit. Oh, is there a galley? First compartment on the right.
Mischief.
Sorry, somebody is being very impolite and extremely cute, but also very impolite. First compartment on the right. Is there anything you require? Theoda asked halfway to the galley. My needs are supplied for the next 100 years, Helva said coldly, realizing as the words were formed that her critical need could not be met. I'm sorry, I know very little of you ships, Theoda apologized. I've never had preferential treatment like this before, and she smiled shyly. Your home planet is Medea, inquired Helva with reluctant courtesy. It was not uncommon for a professional person to claim the planet of his current employer. Yes, Medea, Theoda replied. She made immediate noise with the rations she held, banging them into the table with unnecessary violence. Her reaction suggested some inner conflict or grief, but Helva could recall nothing of great moment connected with Medea, so she must assume that Theoda's problem was personal. I've seen your type of ship before, of course. We of Medea have reason to be grateful to you, but I've never actually been in one. Theoda was talking nervously, her eyes restlessly searching over the supplies in the galley cupboards, rearranging the containers to see the back of the shelves. Do you enjoy your work? It must have a tremendous satisfaction. Such innocent words to drop like hot cinders on Helva's unhealed grief. Rapidly, Helva began to talk, anything to keep herself from being subjected to another such unpredictably rasping civility. I haven't been commissioned long, she said. As a physiotherapist, you must certainly be aware of our origin. Oh, yes, of course. Birth defect. And Theoda looked embarrassed, as if she had touched on a vulgar subject. I still think it's horrible. You had no choice, she blurted out angrily. Helva suddenly felt superior. Initially, perhaps not, but now it would be very difficult to give up hurtling through space and be content with walking. Theoda flushed at the almost scornful emphasis of the final word. I leave that to whoever is my brawn, and Helva inwardly cringed as she reminded herself again of Jenin. I've recently heard of one of you ships who sings, said Theoda. Yes, I have too, said Helva unencouragingly. Must everything remind her of her loss? How long do you live? As long as we wish. That is, who is the oldest ship?
You're not getting it. She is very cute and very stubborn.
Who's the oldest ship? One of the 200s is still in active service. Oh, you're not very old then, being an 800. No. I am, said Theoda, staring at the empty ration unit she held in one hand. I'm very near my end now, I think. And there was no regret in her voice, not even resignation. It occurred to Helva that here too was someone with deep sorrow marking time. How many more hours until planetfall? 47. I must study, and abruptly Theoda rummaged in her kit for a film file and viewer. What is the problem? Helva asked. Van Gogh in Lyra 2 was hit by space plague similar in manifestation to that which attacked Medea 125 years ago, Theoda explained. Suddenly, Helva knew why Theoda had been in service ships. She microscoped her vision on Theoda's face and saw the myriad tiny lines that indicated advanced age. Theoda had undoubtedly been alive on Medea at the time of the plague. Helva recalled that the plague had struck a heavily populated area and swept with terrific violence throughout the entire planet in a matter of days. Its onslaught so fierce and its toll so great that medical personnel often collapsed over the sick they tended. Others inexplicably survived untouched. The airborne disease spores struck animal as well as human, and then, as suddenly as it had come, almost as if the disease were aware that the resources of the galaxy were on the way to subdue its ravages, it disappeared. Medea had been decimated in the course of a week, and the survivors, both the ones hardy enough to endure the intense fever and pain, and those who were curiously immune, spent their years trying to discover the source or the cause, cure or vaccine. From her capacious, trained associative recall, Helva found 7 other different, but similarly inexplicable plague waves, some treated with better success than Medea's. The worst one to be recorded had hit the planet of Clematis, eliminating 93% of all human life before help arrived. Clematis had been placed under eternal quarantine. Helva thought that was rather locking the barn and never bothering to track down the missing horses. You had, I gather, sufficient experience with Medea's plague, so that your presence may be of help to Van Gogh's people. That is the thought, said Theoda, wincing. She had picked up her film viewer purposefully, and Helva realized that more discussion was out of order. She knew, too, that Theoda had a painful word association, even at the end of a long life. Helva could not imagine a time centuries hence when mention of Jenin would not hurt. Anagon swam into view precisely as the trip chronometer edged into 67 hours, and Helva found herself immediately answering a quarantine warning from an orbital monitor. You have physiotherapist Theoda on board, do you not? Helva was asked as she identified herself. I do. Your landing should set you down as close to the hospital city of Urfar as possible. There is, however, no space field in that vicinity, and a meadow has been set aside for your use. Are you able to control your dangerous exhausts? Helva wryly assured them of her ability to land circumspectly. They gave her the latitude and longitude, and she had no difficulty in bringing herself to a stand in the patch-sized meadow so indicated. A powdery white road led to a long white complex of multi-windowed buildings half a kilometer away. From the complex came a land vehicle. Theoda, said Helva as they awaited the arrival of the land car, In the effects compartment under the control panel, you will find a small gray button with it attached to your uniform. You can maintain communication with me. If you would be so good as to rotate the upper section of the button clockwise, I can have two-way contact. It would afford me some satisfaction to be in on the problems you encounter. Yes, certainly, of course. Also, if you rotate the bottom half of the button, I have limited scope of vision as well. How clever, murmured Theoda, examining the button before attaching it to her tunic. As the car drew to a halt, Theoda waved at the occupants from the high lock and stepped onto the lift. Oh, Helva, thank you for the journey, and my apologies, I've not been very good company. Nor have I been. Good luck. As Theoda descended, Helva knew that for a lie. They had been perfect company, each locked in separate miseries. Somehow it had escaped her mind that grief was a frequent visitor in the universe, and her inability to aid Jenin was scarcely unique. Her sister ships had all had such experiences, and were still at their jobs. None of them ever loved their bronze as I did Jenin, she soliloquized sullenly, perfectly conscious of how ill her sentiment befitted her steel, yet unable to extricate her thoughts from the unconscious return to misery. Request permission to board, came a rough voice at the lift bottom. Identification. Senior Medical Officer Onro, detached, Regulus base. I need to use your tight beam. Permission granted, replied Helva after a rapid check of the name and the Medoff roster on file. Medoff Onro plunged into the Herlock and, with the briefest of salutes at her central shaft, lunged into the pilot's chair and slapped home the call button on the beam. Have you any honest-to-God coffee? He grated out, swiveling the chair to launch himself from it toward the galley. Be my guest, murmured Helva, unprepared for such vigor after several days of Theoda. Onro's shoulder took a bruising as he careened off the threshold to the galley, wrenched open the cupboards, knocking containers about. Coffee may still be in its accustomed place on the third shelf in the right-hand locker, Helva remarked dryly. Oh, excuse me. A container just rolled onto the floor. Onro retrieved it, but cracked his head smartly on the corner of the cupboard as the door he had left open. The stream of invective that Helva had expected did not come. The man carefully closed the cupboard with the controlled patience of the much put upon and, breaking the heat seal, immediately stalked back to the central cabin and resumed his seat, watching the dial on the tight beam as it warmed slowly to peak, never blinking as he gulped the now steaming hot coffee. Even as he swallowed, the springs in his taut frame began to unwind. Creatures of habit, aren't we, X-Ray Hotel? X-Ray, XH. I've been dreaming of coffee for 18 mortal days and nights. The stuff they use in its place on this lousy dump of ill-assorted metals makes me sleepy. Coffee is not as potent as Benzedrine, nor half as rough on the system. Ah, there they are. I swear these beams take longer every time I have to fool with the damn things. Central Base Regulus. XH-834 reporting, announced Onro. Who? Gasped an unofficial voice. Onro talking. Oh, yes, sir. I didn't recognize your voice. What, did you think Helva had a cold? No, sir, that wasn't what I thought. Well, never mind the chit-chat. Put this on the computers and let it do a little brainstorming. I'm too tired. You'd better check the computeries, too. I haven't been asleep much lately. He turned to Helva. How do you like the luck? First home leave in 3 galactic years, and I have to time my arrival with the plagues. I wonder if I can get a rebate on vacation time. He turned back to the beam. Here's the garbage. And he rapidly dictated the material. Now here's a verbal to check it. Disease unidentifiable on the Orson scale as a known virus or variation thereof. Patients thoroughly tested and apparently perfectly healthy can develop clinical symptoms within 10 hours. Complete deterioration of muscle control, presence of high fever, excessive spinal pain follow in 3 days. Death caused by 1. Brain hemorrhage, 2. Heart failure, 3. Lung collapse, 4. Strangulation, or in case where medical help has been late in arriving, 5. Starvation. All survivals unable to make muscular coordinations of any kind. Extent of brain damage negative, but they might as well be dead. Impairment to intellect? Asked Central Control. Impossible to ascertain except to hope that the injury to the brain has, as usual, left the intellect alone. Julia O'Grady and the Colonel's lady are sisters under the skin, muttered Helva, for she could see through the Medoff's words that the victims of the plague had not been as robbed of their bodies by disease as she had been by birth defects. Our skin-tight friend is closer to the truth than she knows, Honor snorted. Except for the infants. There isn't one of them now that wouldn't be better off in a shell right now. They aren't going to go anywhere the way they are. Do you wish to stand by for the report? Asked Central Control. Take long? You could get a little sleep, suggested Helva blandly. These reports don't usually take too long, she added, tapping out a private distress signal to Central as she spoke. Not long, Medoff, Onro, said Central on cue. You'll get a crick in your neck, Onro, remarked Helva as she saw him stretch out his long legs and scrunch down in the pilot chair for a catnap. Use the pilot's bed. I'll give you a jolt as soon as the message returns. Pfft, you better or I'll unscrew your safety panel, Onro snapped, lurching drunkenly towards the bunk. Yes, of course. Helva watched as he took the 2 deep breaths that were all that he needed before he was oblivious. Her contact with Theoda began, sight and sound. Theoda was bending over a bed, her strong fingers soothing the motionless frame of the woman there. Flaccid muscles, lack of reflexes, pasty skin, unfocusing eyes, loose mouth. The cords of the neck strained briefly as the patient made some incoherent sound deep in the throat. There is no sensation in the extremities that we can discover, the voice of an out-of-sight person said. There is some reaction to pain in the torso and in the face, but we can't be sure. The patient, if she understands us, can give us no sign. Helva noticed, and she hoped that Theoda did, that the half-closed eyelids made an almost imperceptible downward motion, then upward. Helva also observed the flaring of the nostrils. Theoda, she said quietly so as not to startle her. Even so, Theoda straightened quickly in surprise. Helva? Yes. In the scope of my limited range of vision, I could see a twitch of the eyelids and a motion of the nostrils. If the paralysis is as acute as I have learned from Medoff Onro, these bare flickers may be the only muscle control the patient has. Please ask one of the observers to concentrate on the right eye, the other on the left, and you to observe only the nostrils. Perhaps a pattern of reply and explain, establish a pattern of reply and explain it to the patient and see if she understands. Is that the ship? An off-site person demanded irritably. Yes, the XH-834 that brought me here. Oh, was the disparaging reply. That's the one that sings. I thought it was JH or GH. Helva is not an it, said Theoda firmly. Let us try her suggestion, since her vision is considerably more acute than ours, and her concentration far superior. To the patient, Theoda said quietly and distinctly, if you can hear me, please try to lower your right eyelid. For an age-long second there was no movement. Then, as though the effort were tremendous, The right lid slowly descended the barest fraction. In order to be sure that this was not an involuntary motion, will you try to dilate your nostrils twice? Very slowly, Helva caught the motion of the nostrils. She also saw, which was much more important, the tiny beads of perspiration on the upper lip and brow, and quickly called attention to them. What a tremendous effort this must be for that imprisoned mind, said Theoda, with infinite compassion. Her blunt-fingered hand rested softly on the moist forehead. Rest now, dear. We will not press you further, but now we have hope for you. Only Helva was aware of the disconsolate sag and then straightening of Theoda's shoulders as she walked to the next bed. Helva accompanied Theoda through the entire tour of the plague hospital, from the men's and women's wards to the children's and even the nursery. The plague had been no respecter of age, and the babies of a few weeks had been affected. One would have hopes that in the younger and more resilient body, those tissues that were damaged, if any have been, would stand the best chance of regeneration, remarked one of Theoda's guides.
Mischief.
Helva caught part of a gesture that took in the cribs of 50 motionless infants in the ward. Theoda leaned down and picked up a small, pink-blonde infant of 3 months. The flesh was firm, the color good. She tweaked the pectoral fold with an unnecessary force. The baby's eyes widened and the mouth fell open. A slight croak issued from the throat. Quickly, Theoda snatched the child to her breast, rocking it in apology for the pain. Sight and sound were muffled by the blanket, but not before Helva, too, had seen and realized exactly what Theoda had. Theoda was rocking the child so that Helva caught only elusive fragments of a violent discussion. Then her scope of sight and sound returned as Theoda laid the child in the crib on its stomach and carefully started to move the child's arms and legs in an approximation of the crabbed action that is the beginning of independent locomotion. We will do this with every child, with every person, for 1 hour every morning and every afternoon. If necessary, we will commandeer every adult and responsible adolescent on Anagon for our therapists. If we are to reach the brain to restore contact between intellect and nerve, we must repattern the brain centers for the very beginning of brain function. Or from the very beginning of brain function. We must work quickly. Those poor imprisoned people have waited long enough to be released from their hells. But on what do you base your premise, physiotherapist Theoda? You admitted that the Median plague has fewer points of similarity than originally thought. I can't give you a premise right now. Why must I? My whole experience leads me to know that I'm right. Experience? I think you mean intuition, continued the official stuffily. And we cannot, on the basis of one woman's intuition, conscript the workforce needed from busy citizens. Didn't you see the beads of sweat on that woman's face? The effort required to do a simple thing as lower an eyelid, demanded Theoda tartly. Can any effort required of us be too much? There's no need to get emotional, Theoda was told testily. Anagon has opened herself to these survivors with no thought of the danger of exposure to the same virus. Oh, nonsense, Theoda said. Before your ships approached Van Gogh, you made certain that the plague had passed, but that is neither here nor there. I will return to the ship and contact Central Control. I'll have your premise and authorization all neatly printed out. She whirled around, facing back into the ward, so that Helva could see the respectfully waiting ward nurses. But any of you who love children and trust another woman's instinct, do as I just did, whether it is authorized or not. There is nothing to be lost, and the living to be released. Theoda stormed out of the hospital, brushing aside the complaints and temporizing of the officials. She stumbled into the land car, ordering it back to the ship. Her tight, terrible voice made the driver hold his tongue. Helva could see her strong fingers washing themselves, straining in tense clasp of frustration. Never idle, groping, grasping, clenching. Then Theoda reached up to the button and cut the contact abruptly. Unconcerned, Helva switched to the wide vision of her exterior scanners and picked up the land car as it sped towards her. The car discharged its passenger and left, but Theoda did not step onto the lift. Somewhat at a distance, because of the angle, Helva could only watch as Theoda paced back and forth. In the bunk, Onro slept on, and Helva waited. "Permission to enter," said Theoda finally, in a low voice. "Granted." Stumbling again, one hand in front of her as if feeling her way, Theoda entered the ship. Wearily, she sagged into the pilot's chair, and leaning forward onto the console, buried her head in her arms. "You saw, Helva," muttered the therapist. "You saw those people. They've been like that for upward of 6 weeks. To move an eyelid with a commensurate effort of budging a ton, how many will come out of this sane?" "They have additional hope, Theoda. Don't forget. Once you can establish that the integral intellect remains, the body may be bypassed. There are advantages to that, you know," she reminded the therapist. Theoda's head came up, and she turned in her chair, looking in amazement at the panel concealing Helva's shell-encased body. "Of course, you're a prime example, aren't you?" Then she shook her head in disagreement. "No, Helva, it's one thing to be bred up to it, and another to be forced into it as the only expedient. The young would experience no shock at shell life, and there are, I repeat, advantages to even distinct gains to be made. Witness my ability to follow your tour. But to have walked and touched and smelled and laughed and cried. To have cried," gasped Helva. "To be able to weep, oh yes." And an unendurable tightness filled her mind as her brief respite from grief dissolved. "Helva, in the hospital, I'd heard that you. I'm sorry, I was so lost in my own problem that I didn't realize that you were the ship who sank, and that you'd." Her voice trailed off. "Nor did I remember that at Medea the virus didn't just isolate the intellect in the body, it destroyed it, leaving it only a mindless husk." Theoda turned her head away. That poor baby. "Central Control to X-Ray Hotel 834. Are you receiving?" Theoda, startled by the voice at her elbow, jerked back from the lighted tight beam face. "X-Ray Hotel 834 receiving. Prepare to tape computer report on Medoff Onro's request." Helva activated the apparatus and gave the A-OK. "Verbal?" asked Theoda in a stage whisper. "Verbal requested," Helva relayed. "No correlation between age, physical stature, health, ethnic group, blood type, tissue structure, diet, location, medical history is indicated. Disease random, epidemic force. No correlation muscle, bone, tissue, blood, sputum, urine, marrow in post-plague postmortem. Negative medication, negative operation, possible therapy." "There!" cried Theoda in triumph, jumping to her feet. "Therapy, the only positive. Only possible. But the only positive factor nonetheless, and I'm positive it's repatterning." "Repatterning?" "Yes, it's a bizarre therapy and it doesn't always work, but the failure may have been because the intellect had retreated in desperation," Theoda argued with vehement confidence. "To be trapped, unable to make even the simplest communication, can you imagine how ghastly that must be? Oh, what am I saying?" she said, turning in horror towards Helva's presence. "Oh, you are quite right," Helva assured her blandly with inner amusement. "It would be unbearable if I could no longer control the synapses as I do now electronically. I think I should go mad having known what it is to dive between the stars, to talk across light years, to eavesdrop in tight places, maintaining my own discreet impregnability." Theoda resumed her restless pacing. "But you don't really think," Helva said, "that you're going to get those skeptics to do some of the necessary recruiting on the basis of the computer report?" "The therapy was a positive factor," Theoda insisted, her face set in stubborn lines. "It was a possible. I'm not arguing with your position. only pointing out their reaction, she added, as she saw Theoda gathering breath to protest. I'm convinced they won't be, and it won't be the first time when Good Samaritans have decided to rest on their laurels prematurely, convinced that they have, in conscience, done all they could. Theoda set her lips. I'm positive those people can be saved, or at least enough of them to make every effort worthwhile. Why? Why do you think repatterning will do the trick? It's a 20th century technique used before correction of the majority of prenatal defects, and with some severe brain or neural accidents. I took my degree in physiotherapeutic history. So many of the early problems in the field no longer exist, but occasionally, of course, an ancient disease reappears suddenly, like the epidemic of poliomyelitis on Avartis II. Then the old skills are revived. This plague, for instance, is like the Rothschild virus, only the original strain attacked sporadically and recovery was slow but certain. Perhaps because therapy was initiated as soon as the painful phase passed. Also, I believe that the paralysis was not so acute, but the strain has obviously mutated in the centuries and become more virulent. However, the similarity cannot be denied. I brought my tapes, Helva, Theoda said eagerly, enthusiasm giving her face the semblance of youth. The Delgado repatterning was used with great effect on the victims of the Rothschild virus. You don't suppose, said Theoda, stopped dead in her tracks. We could also prove that the space plague spores had passed by old Terra at the time. Have you any details on the galactic spiral patterns? Stick to the medical and physiological aspects, Theoda, laughed Helva. Theoda scrubbed at her face with her hands as though she could wash away the fatigue and stimulate her tired brain to inspiration. Just one child, one proof, that's all I need. How long would it take? What child is best? Why a child? Why not that poor woman with the eyelid? The medulla handles reflex action at birth. The pons, maturing at 20 weeks, directs crawling on the stomach. By 15 weeks, the midbrain has begun to function, and the child begins to learn to creep on hands and knees. By 60 weeks, the cortex begins to act and controls walking, speech, vision, hearing, tactile, and manual competence. A year would be too young, no understandable speech, Helva mused, out loud, remembering her first birthday without effort. She had already been walking and talking. The best age is 5, said another voice. Theoda grasped as she saw Onro standing in the galley, a warming container in one hand. Because that is the age of my son. I'm Onro, mid-officer. I sent for you, physiotherapist Theoda, because I heard you never give up. His face still creased with blanket folds, turned hard, determined. I won't give up either until my son walks, talks, and laughs again. He's all I have left. What a way to spend a happy vacation. Onro laughed bitterly, then gulped at the steaming coffee. You're Van Goghian, Theoda demanded. By chance, and one of the immunes. You heard what I was saying. You agree. I've heard. I neither agree nor disagree. I'll try anything that sounds even remotely feasible. Your idea is reasonable, and the computer has only the one positive suggestion. Therapy. I'll bring my son. He turned when he reached the lock, shook his fist back at Helva. You drugged me, you silver-plated sorceress.
Sneak. Stop mischieving.
You drugged me, you silver-plated sorceress. An accurate analysis, but the insult is accepted. An inaccurate analysis, but the insult is accepted, Helva said as he disappeared, scowling down the lift. Elated, Theoda snatched out her viewer and carefully restudied the films of the techniques she would try. They use steroids as medications, she mumbled. Have you any? No medication was indicated on the report, Helva reminded her. But you can get Onro to steal what you require from the synthesizer in the hospital. He is senior med officer. Yes, that helps, said, and Theoda lapsed again into fierce concentration. Why did they use... Oh, yes, of course. They didn't have any conglomerates, did they? Fascinated, Helva watched as Theoda scanned the film, winding and rewinding, checking, rechecking, making notations, muttering to herself, pausing to gaze off into space with abstracted thought. Then Theoda had thought her notes. Bleh. When Theoda had been through her notes the fourth time, Helva insisted with authority that she eat something. Theoda had just finished the stew when Onro returned with the limp body of the red-headed child in his arms. Onro's rough face was impassive, almost rigid in its lack of expression, as the child was tenderly laid down on the bunk. Helva noticed the almost universal trait of the victims, the half-closed eyes, as if the lids were too heavy to keep open. Kneeling down beside the bunk, Theoda turned the boy's face so that her eyes were directly on a level with his. Child, I know that you can hear. We are going to work your body to help you remember what your body could do. Soon we will have you running under the sun again. Without more ado, and disregarding Onro's guttural protest, she placed the boy on his stomach on the deck, seized one arm and one leg, and signaled Onro to do likewise. We're taking you back to the time when you were a baby and first tried to creep. We are making your body crawl forward on your belly like a snake. In a patient monotone, she droned her instructions. Helva timed the performance at 15 minutes. They walked a full hour and repeated the drill. Another hour passed, and Theoda, equally patient, droned instructions to pattern the child's body in walking, upright position, and alternating the left hand with right foot and right hand with left foot. Another hour, and she repeated the walking. Then back to crawling again and again in double repetition. The two therapists caught naps when they could. Surreptitiously, Helva closed her lock, cut the cabin audio on her relays, and ignored the insistent radio demands from the hospital that she put Theoda or Onro on the radio. After 24 hours, Theoda alternated the two patterns and included basic muscular therapy on the lax body, patiently, manipulating the limbs in the various attitudes and postures, down to the young toes and fingers. By the 27th hour, Onro, worn by previous exhaustion, frustration, and increasing hopelessness, dropped into a sleep from which violent shaking could not rouse him. Theoda, looking more and more gray, continued, making each repetition of every motion as carefully and fully as she had the first time she started the intensive patterning. Helva ignored the crowd outside. She paid no attention to the muted demands, threats, and entreaties. Theoda, Helva said softly in the 30th hour, have you noticed, as I have, the tendency of the neck muscles to contort? Yes, I have, and this child was once so far gone that a tracheotomy was necessary. Notice the scar here, and she pointed to the thin mark. I see too that the eyelids describe a slightly larger arc than when we began the therapy. The child knows we are helping him. See, his eyes open ever so slightly, but it is enough. I was right. I knew I was right. You won't have much more time, Helva said. The authorities on Anagon have called in a service craft, and it is due to land beside me in half an hour. I will be forced to open or risk damage to the ship, which I am conditioned to avoid. Theoda looked up, startled. What do you mean? Look in on my screen. Helva turned on the picture at the pilot's console so that Theoda could see the crowd of people and vehicles clustered at the base of the ship. They are getting a bit insistent. I had no idea. You needed quiet. I could at least supply that, Helva replied. But to all intents and purposes, their senior medical officer, his son, and their visiting technical advisor are imprisoned inside of me, and they suspect that I am turning rogue. But didn't you tell them that we are conducting therapy? Well, naturally. Of all the ridiculous... It's time for therapy. Every minute is necessary now. First you must be fed. Theoda carefully inserted the concentration solution. Theoda carefully inserted the concentrated solution in the thin vein, smoothing down the lump that formed as the nutritive spray entered. A sweet child, I imagine, Helva, from his face. She said. A young hellion with all those freckles, snorted Helva. They are usually the sweetest inside, Theoda said firmly. Helva noticed the eyelids droop down on the check and raise again. She decided she was right, not the therapist. Imagine calling red hair and freckles sweet. Again, the patient routine, the assisted patterning, then a loud thud startled Theoda. It shook the sleeping form of the doctor where he lay on the deck. Helva, with one eye outside, had expected the blow. Onro roused himself garrulously, unaware at first of his surroundings. What's the matter? A second dull thud. What in the hell's happening? Who's knocking? Well, half the planet, remarked Helva dryly, and tuned up the exterior visual and oral. She immediately cut down the nearly deafening noise. All right, she said loudly to the audience, her voice amplifying easily over the angry roars. Demand permission to enter X-Ray Hotel 834, squalled someone at her base. She meekly activated the lift and opened the lock. Onro stamped to the opening and leaned down, shouting, What in hell's matter here? Go away, all of you! Have you no decency? What's the bloody fuss about? Can't a man get some sleep around here? Only quiet place on this whole lousy planet. The lift had by then come abreast of him, with the brawn of the service ship and the stuffy hospital official of Theoda's tour. Sorry, puppy interruptions. Med Officer Onro, we feared for you, particularly when your son was discovered missing from his bed. Administrator Karif, did you expect that the lady therapist had kidnapped me and my son and was holding us hostage on a rogue ship? Throw mine into the stall. Hey, what are you doing, you young squirt? He demanded as the Brawn made a pass at the protected panel of Helva's shaft. I'm following orders from Central Control. If you warm up that tight beam in Central Control to mind its own damn business, weren't for Helva here and the peace and quiet she maintained for us, don't know where we'd be at. He stalked into the cabin where his son lay on the floor, with Theoda painstakingly applying her Doman Delcato therapy. Don't know how many will save this way, but it does work, and you, young man, will tell Central Control after you've told them to go to hell for me, that they will issue authority to Theoda to recruit any and all, if necessary, of this planet's population as a therapy force to activate her rehabilitation program. He got down on his knees by his son. All right, my boy, crawl. Why, that child would catch a cold in this draft, the official exclaimed. Some woman was trying to get Helva to lower the lift for her, but Helva ignored her as the beads of sweat started on the child's face. There was no muscular movement, not so much as a twitch. Son, try, pleaded Onro. Your mind remembers what your body could do. Right arm forward, left knee up, said Theoda, with such control that no hint of the tension that she must be feeling showed in her calm, gentle tones. Helva could see the boy's throat muscles moving convulsively, but she knew the watchers were expecting more dramatic motions. Come on, Mama, sweet little freckle-faced boy, she drawled in an irritatingly insulting voice. You have to be patient, little one. I'm almost done. Before the annoyed watchers could turn to remonstrate her, the boy's elbow had actually slid an inch on the floor, and the left knee, slightly flexed by Theoda's hands, skidded behind as the throat worked violently, and a croaking sound issued from his lips with a cry of inarticulate joy. Onro clasped his son to him. You see, Theoda's right! I see that the child made a voluntary movement, yes, Karif was forced to agree. But one isolated example is... He spread his hands expressively, unconvinced. One is enough. We haven't had time for more, Onro said. I'll put it to the people out there. They'll be the workforce. Carrying his son to the lock, he yelled down what had happened. There was great cheering and applause. Then the little group at the base of the ship kept pointing urgently to the woman who had begged for the lift. I can't hear you, Onro called, for many people were shouting at once, all trying to get across the same idea. Helva sent the lift down, and the woman came up to it. As soon as she is halfway to Onro, she shouted her message. In the nursery, we did as therapist Theoda suggested. There's already some improvement among the children. Not much, and we want to know what we were doing wrong, but 4 of the babies have already started to cry. She babbled, stepping into the ship and running to Theoda, where the woman leaned wearily against the door jamb. I never expected to be happy to hear a baby cry again, but some of them are crying and some are making awful sounds. And one little girl, she even waved a hand when she was diapered. Oh, we've just done as what you said. Theoda looked her triumph at Karif, and he, shrugging in acceptance of the accomplishment, nodded. Now, Karif, Onro briskly stepped onto the lift, his son still cradled in his arms. This is what we'll do. How we'll organize. We don't have to take everyone on your very busy planet. The youth corps can be called in from Avalon, just their bag of tricks. Thank you for believing in me, Theoda told the nurse. One of the babies was my sister's, the woman said softly with tears in her eyes. She's the only one left alive from the entire town. The easy part is over, Helva. Now it's uphill. Encouraging, instructing, upholding patience. Even Onro's son has a long, long way to go in therapy before he approaches his pre-plague physical condition. Yes, baby. You will have water in a minute. I love you. Just give me a minute. I love you. But at least there's hope. There is always hope while there is life. Was it your son? Asked Helva. Yes, and my daughter, and my husband, and my whole family. I was the only immune. And Theoda's face contorted. With all my training, with all the skill of years of practice, I couldn't save them. Theoda's eyes closed against that remembered agony. Helva blacked out her own vision and remembered with deep indrawn breath as Theoda's words echoed the protest she herself had voiced at her ineffectuality. It still burned in her mind, the searing memory of Jenin looking toward her as he died. I don't know why one makes a certain emotional adjustment, Theoda said wearily. I guess it's just the survival factor, forcing you to go on preserving sanity and identity by refocusing on its values. You're going to have to remind me not to drink some water. This is now puppy water. I felt that if I could learn my profession so well that never again would I have to watch someone I loved die because of my ineffectiveness, then the ignorance that killed my family could be forgiven. But how could you have turned a space plague? Helva demanded. Oh, I know I couldn't have, but I still won't forgive myself. Helva turned Theoda's words over in her mind, letting their significance sink into her like an anesthetic salve. Thank you, Theoda, she said finally, looking up again at the therapist. Wait. What are you crying for? She asked, astonished to see Theoda sitting on the edge of her bunk, tears streaming unheeded down her face. You. Because you can't, can you? And you lost your Jenin, and they never even gave you a chance to rest. They just ordered you to take me here, and Helva stared at Theoda, torn with a variety of emotions, incredulous that someone else did understand her grief over Jenin, that Theoda was, at this moment of her own triumph, concerned by Helva's sorrow. She felt the hard knot of grief coming untied, and she was suddenly rather astonished that she, Helva, was the object of pity. "Oh, by the almighty, Helva, wake up!" shouted Onro at her base. Helva hurriedly sent down the lift for him. "What on earth are you crying for?" Don't bother to answer," he rattled on, charging into the cabin and snatching Theoda's kit bag from her limp hands. He plowed on into the galley. "It's undoubtedly in a good cause, but there's a whole planet waiting for your instructions." He was scooping up all of the coffee containers he could find and stuffing them into the kit bag and his pockets. "I promise you can cry all you want once you've given me the therapy routine." He made a cradle for her hands and piled more coffee cans in. "Then I'll lend you my shoulder." "She's got mine any time she wants," Helva put in, a little unsteadily. Onro stopped long enough to glance at Helva. "You're not making any sense either," he said in an irascible voice. "You haven't got a shoulder." "She's making perfectly good sense," Theoda said, stoutly, as Onro started to push her towards the lock. "Come on, Theoda, come on." "Thank you, my friend," Theoda murmured, turning back to Helva. Then she whirled away, allowing Onro to start the lift. No, Theoda. I'm the one who's grateful," Helva called as Theoda's head disappeared past the edge of the lock. Softly to herself she added, "I needed tears." As the land car zoomed back towards the hospital complex, Helva could see Theoda's arm waving farewell, and knew Theoda understood all that hadn't been said. The dust settled down on the road to the hospital as Helva signaled Regula's base of the completion of her mission and her estimated return. Then, like a phoenix rising again from the bitter ashes of her 100 hours of mourning, Helva lifted on her brilliant tail of exploding fuel towards the stars and towards healing. And that, O best beloved, is enough for tonight. There's still plenty more book. So, I always liked this book, mostly because it's about very much about finding strength in what other people would call weakness, and solving problems through human connection. I find that very, very encouraging. And you guys got me crying again. Well, that's me just being all weepy and soft and sensitive and squishy. Anyway, your Uncle Navi just wants to remind you that if people can hate without knowing, then I can love you without knowing you. And I just want you to grow into somebody that you can be proud of. But for now, it's late, and you need to get some rest. So, you'll see me next time.